They told him to crawl. The word left the manager's mouth small and precise, like a coin dropped into a fountain. Fluorescent lights hummed above. The checkout lane had the sour, clean smell of disinfectant mixed with burnt coffee. Robert sat in his wheelchair at the conveyor, one prosthetic foot balanced on the metal footrest, veteran plates on the back of his chair catching the light like a quiet claim. He had moved through the morning with the old, careful confidence of a man used to holding his own. A veteran, quiet, polite. Then the manager, Walsh, leaned over the plastic divider and asked what he thought was a joke. When it became clear he was not joking, the aisle narrowed to a single, bright line of humiliation. If you value stories about people standing up for dignity and you want to see how a town can choose honor over cruelty, stay until the end and subscribe for more. Hit like if you believe ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference. Someone in line had already hit record. The phone angle was low. The band of the wheelchair's wheel, the cheap linoleum, Walsh's face as he barked the order. Amy, the cashier, pressed her palm to her mouth with the suddenness of someone realizing the world has tilted. Marcus, a high school kid with a backpack 2 sizes too big, stepped forward with a folded 20 and a handful of protest in his eyes. In the video, Robert's jaw tightened once, then again, as if setting a foundation for what he would not say. He did not crawl. The camera kept rolling. Robert's life before that moment was a string of small, stubborn continuities. Morning coffee at his kitchen table, a newspaper folded across his lap, phone calls from a daughter who lived 3 towns away. He had lost limbs years ago in a war that still sat in him like a memory with sedatives. There in the scar tissue of a knee, in the way he turned too fast when someone shouted. He wore his uniform patch tucked under a sweater on noisy days, not because he wanted credit, but because it reminded him who he had been when the world was asked to make sense of itself. He had taught himself to walk again in pieces, to be patient. Dignity had been neither given nor taken. It had been rebuilt, stubbornly, day by day. Walsh was not a monster in the grand sense. He had a face that had learned to order things into neat categories, shoppers who were cash and shoppers who were problems. He had worked his way up from low management into a narrower view of respect, his own. That morning, something in him miscalculated a man's quiet and turned it into suspicion. He wanted control. Control for Walsh sometimes came wrapped in humiliation, because it was cheaper than explanation and quicker than listening. When he said crawl, it was his exercise of power turned grotesque. Amy moved, like she weighed the aisle with her whole body. Her hands were still damp from scanning the last customer's coupons. She had a soft way of seeing people because she had cared for her grandmother, a nurse's niece who knew how to measure trouble and find a way through. "Sir," she whispered, leaning forward, "that's not—" Her voice broke on the aisle like a reed. The cash register's beep kept time as if nothing else mattered. Marcus was the accidental hero. A teenager with a loose moral grammar, he had watched his grandfather teach him that respect was not earned by being loud, but by choosing the right thing when it matters. He held out his 20 like an offering or a challenge. "Take it," he said. "Let me pay." When Walsh refused, Marcus's face flushed with something close to righteous heat. He pushed his phone forward on the conveyor, the video already live in his hands. The clip moved outward like water. A friend posted it, a relative shared. In hours, it drifted from neighborhood groups into feeds, and then into feeds of feeds, the small-town cruelty made public. People tagged veterans groups. Someone in a neighboring county texted the Iron Brotherhood, a motorcycle club known in the area for charity runs and graveyard rides. Jake read the message in a diner at the edge of town, napkin-stained and thoughtful. He had been a mechanic once and a sergeant in another life, and now he wore the club's patch in the way someone wears a promise. Jake did the math fast. He thought of his own father, brittle with time and stubborn with memory. He thought of the look on Robert's face in the video, an old man's dignity being language violated in a fluorescent-lit aisle. He called 3 numbers. He didn't plan a riot. He planned a presence. "Tell them no violence," he said into the receiver, and the line hummed with agreement. The Iron Brotherhood did not relish trouble. They made a profession of honor, and that morning they would practice it with chrome and throttle and solemn oath. The ride sheet messages came in like drum beats: breakfast at 8, roll at 9, meet at the East Lot. People arrived with helmets under their arms and scarves thought through twice. Leather jackets looked like armor, and for once they were armor for something other than bravado. "No fights," Jake said to the assembled cluster. "Just make sure he never has to humiliate another man in our town." They moved in a montage that felt cinematic even to people who had never been at a protest. A dozen bikes, then 50, then 100, swelling as word spread. Engines choked the air and then filled it with a steady thrum, an honesty of sound that demanded attention. Chrome flashed in the morning sun. Leather smelled of oil and nicotine and old roads. The Iron Brotherhood's riders threaded toward the supermarket parking lot with the deliberateness of men who had thought this through. Stand, bear witness, insist on accountability. They parked in rows like an army that had decided to be gentle. Inside, the store remained a hive of small humiliations. Walsh, sensing the spill of his action into a larger current, grew defensive. His voice hardened when the district manager called. "He crossed the line," Amy said quietly when she found Robert again later in the back office, in a room smelling of bleach and sorrow. There was a tremor in her hands, but not a retreat. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant the company and the aisle and the way the day had broken. Robert listened. He let the words collect. There was no long speech from him, only small, sharp truths. "It took me a long time to walk into a store and not feel like I had to explain my body," he said. "I didn't come here to be seen as anything but who I am." Across the town, the video kept its slow, inexorable work. People watched the frame and held the image like a ledger. There was outrage, yes, but also that shift from passive attention to action. Donations to veteran groups, messages to corporate hotlines, calls to local radio. The store's corporate office received emails in waves. A PR official, careful with words, arranged a phone call. The district manager wanted the story contained. Walsh wanted to be defended. The online feeds preferred sharp moral categorizations: villain, hero, witness. Life preferred messier things. Jake and the bikers arrived at the storefront an hour later than the video would have you imagine. They came in a steady line, not to storm, but to stand. The parking lot swallowed the rumble, and people inside the store turned their heads. Curiosity sharpened into something like hope. The bikers moved in pairs, boots thudding on asphalt, leather rubbing soft and worn. They did not push through doors. They did not barricade. They simply stood, a line of bodies and bikes, with a tacit understanding that the town was watching. When they stepped into the store, the change was immediate. Voices fell away. The fluorescent buzz seemed thinner. One of the bikers, who had been a teacher once, set a small fold-up speaker on a basket. Jake cued the clip. The same angle, the same commander-like tone from Walsh, the same quiet of Robert's disbelief. It played in the aisle, strange and shrill. People turned toward it like hearing a bell toll. Walsh found himself surrounded by witnesses. He was not attacked. He was watched. The bikers' faces were flat and steady, the opposite of the quick, performative outrage the internet loves. They were calm because they had rehearsed their response in the only way that would count, with restraint. "We are here to make sure this doesn't happen again," Jake said when he found Walsh, voice level, no theatrics. "We want an apology. We want you held accountable. We want your job reviewed." There was a rawness in Jake's words. Not hatred, not glee, but a demand that the town's moral ledger be balanced. "No violence," he added after a beat, almost as if he wanted to name his own conscience in the room. "We will not let this become about us."
Walsh's face went through a series of shifts: defense, fluster, then a kind of heat that came from realizing the cameras had multiplied. Someone handed him his phone. The district manager's voice crackled through. Corporate asked for statements. A line of customers began to clap softly, an awkward sound, as if the town itself were trying to reassert its manners. The immediate consequence came that afternoon. The district manager, faced with the public clip and the biker's presence, made the decision that would be reported later. Walsh was relieved of duty pending investigation. The set of words, relieved of duty, had the clean finality of a press release while containing a lot of messy reality behind it: human beings, payroll systems, union forms. The store's corporate office issued an apology that named the harm, however phrased, and promised better training. It was the kind of institutional response that tries to repair a torn fabric with visible stitches. For Robert, the public vindication was complicated. He did not want a spectacle. He wanted, simply, the right to shop without having his dignity auctioned on a phone screen. Yet when the bikers offered to escort him home, there was something in the offer that was more than practical. It was symbolic. They wrapped him in small courtesies: blankets across knees, a steady arm to hold his wheelchair door. Kids in the neighborhood came out to stand and watch the procession that was not a protest, but a small, solemn convoy. Motorcycles moved slowly down the main street at a pace that allowed people on porches to step outside and see a man being guided with care. Amy received a call from corporate the next week. She was offered a promotion, front-end supervisor, with more training and a voice on the schedule. She cried alone in the employee break room, the way someone cries when a ledger balances and yet the account still stings. Marcus, too, received attention. His small act had been shared and praised. A local nonprofit offered to help with a scholarship fund for his community college tuition. None of these outcomes erased the moment of humiliation, but they rearranged the aftermath into something akin to repair. The town found new rituals. There was, in the weeks that followed, a small parade organized not by politicians but by neighbors. A veterans ride that threaded through Main Street and ended at the veterans' home. The bikers arranged their machines in a circle and invited Robert to sit in the center while the band, a high school jazz group, played a quiet march. People applauded in a way that felt like a town's communal inhale. Photographs were taken. Volunteer groups pledged to organize sensitivity training with the supermarket chain. There were op-eds, some sharp, some reflective. What the cameras
could not show was the interior work, what trust mending looked like in small gestures. Robert accepted Amy's offer of a personal phone call to discuss schedules and stock access so he could avoid the quieter aisles where his prosthesis sometimes snagged. He met with the local veterans counselor and spoke for the first time, in fragments, about the way the order to crawl had sounded like the war all over again, an attempt to make him smaller. He did not want public pity. He wanted people to remember that dignity is not a charity, but a condition. Jake, in the evenings after the event, cleaned the bikes with a slower hand. He would sit in the garage and remember his own father and the small mercies that had once been extended to him. The club's members called their actions practical solidarity. "We didn't need to be viral," one of them said. "We needed to be present." Not everyone agreed with the bikers. There were voices online that argued for forgiveness, others that argued for tougher punishments. The debate was typical of modern outrage, layered, noisy, and easily forgetful. The town's long-term memory was not perfect, but it had been nudged toward a new sensitivity. Training sessions were scheduled. The store's policies were rewritten with language about dignity and accommodation. These bureaucratic pages felt thin next to the human moments. The notes left at Robert's door, the neighbor who carried his groceries, the high schoolers who started a campaign to collect funds for prosthetic maintenance. In the months after, Robert was invited to speak at a small ceremony organized by the bikers and local veterans groups. He accepted reluctantly, then practiced a paragraph or two in his head. The day of the ceremony, he wore a jacket that had been pressed and a pin that read simply, "Service." He did not make speeches about heroes or villains. He spoke about ordinary courage, The courage it takes to refuse humiliation, to stand when the day asks you to be smaller. "It isn't about me," he said into a microphone, voice steady. "It's about asking a town to remember the smallest things about one another." The media moved on as it always does, but the town retained a new practice. When someone in the grocery line faltered, a hand would appear. When a clerk faced trouble, a manager would be asked to step in and listen rather than assume guilt. The bikers kept their helmets, their patches, and a new set of quiet stories about the time they chose to ride for a neighbor. There remained the question of Walsh, where he would go, how he would reckon with what he'd done. People debated whether firing was enough. What felt important was not the punitive ledger so much as the public lesson. Systems must be watched by citizens, and citizens must be ready to show up in ways that keep violence from winning the day. The Iron Brotherhood's ride had been an act of civic armor. It was a reminder that dignity circulates when people decide to defend it. On Veterans Day that year, the town arranged an escort for Robert down Main Street. Flags fluttered, the march of a small band filled the air. He sat in his wheelchair, surrounded by leather and chrome, and people stood respectfully as they passed. The image settled into the community like a promise upheld. A man not made small, a town that remembered. When the parade folded and the engines cooled, Jake leaned in close and simply clasped Robert's hand. There was no grand rhetoric, just the warmth of contact, the sense of a promise kept. At the end, what remained was not perfect justice, because perfect justice is rare and requires more than a viral clip and a convoy. What remained was repair. Appointments kept, training scheduled, a clerk promoted, a teen helped into college, an old veteran escorted through his town with eyes that saw him. The cameras had forced an account, but the work afterward, the conversations, the listening, the community's small rituals, was what rebuilt the place where dignity had been fractured. The final image was not the outrage, but the slow, deliberate walk of people choosing to stand with one another. And that, for a town, felt like enough to carry forward.